Hello and welcome to the Safety Zone. I'm Kevin Grieve and I've been working in the OHS arena now for over 25 years. I've worked in marine transport and logistics sectors, aviation including aeromedical retrieval, mining, heavy engineering, through to domestic construction. My podcast reviews prosecutions against the workplace health and safety and the electrical safety legislation. I will look at the fines issued and any convictions recorded, the sections of legislation breached, and I will also look at what you can do to help prevent such issues occurring in your business or organisation. Hello and welcome to another week. This week I want to have a look at the ATSB, or the Australian Transport Safety Bureau's preliminary report into the mid-air collision of the two helicopters at Main Beach, Gold Coast, Queensland on 2nd of January 2023. I won't be making any comment on this. I'm just going to put out all the findings of the preliminary report because it'd be unfair and unjust to make any comment on an investigation that is only partway finished. So without further ado, let's get started and see what's been found so far.
This preliminary report details factual information established in the investigation's early evidence collection phase and has been prepared to provide timely information to the industry and public. Preliminary reports contain no analysis or findings, which will be detailed in the investigation's final report. The information contained in this preliminary report is released in accordance with Section 25 of the Transport Safety Investigation Act 2003. The occurrence. On the 2nd of January 2023, SeaWorld Helicopters was conducting a series of scenic flights under the visual flight rules from its base at SeaWorld on the Gold Coast, Queensland. The operator was using two Eurocopter 1 EC130B4 helicopters, registered VH-XH9 and VH-XKQ. The helicopters were operating from separate helipads about 220 meters apart. These were Pad 3 at the operator's heliport and the park helipad inside the theme park. Both pilots flew in the morning, then had a lunch break before commencing more flights. At about 13:51 hours and 40 seconds, XH9 departed Pad 3 at the operator's heliport for a 5-minute scenic flight, with the pilot and 5 passengers on board. The 5-minute scenic flight climbed over an area known locally as SeaWorld Grass before tracking northbound coastal over water at 500 feet. At about 13:53 hours and 40 seconds, the pilot of XH9 made an inbound radio call from near Porpoise Point stating their position, height of 500 feet and intention to track to SeaWorld via the Broadwater by making a left turn. Concurrently, at a separate helipad within the theme park, Park Helipad, 2 ground crew were loading passengers into XKQ in preparation for departure. The flight was also planned as a 5-minute scenic flight, with the pilot and 6 passengers on board. The first passenger entered the aircraft at about 13:53 hours and 35 seconds. The ground crew assisted passengers into XKQ, fastened the passengers' seatbelts and helped with the passengers' headsets. The ground crew reported that they completed a final visual check of the helicopter, which included checking all the doors were closed and ensuring the surrounding area was free from hazards, and signaled to the pilot that XKQ was ready for departure. They then went to prepare passengers and information for the next flight. The ground crew later reported that they had not seen any other aircraft before giving the signal for the pilot to depart. On the return leg of the scenic flight in XH9, the track southbound along the Broadwater provided a clear view of the helipads at SeaWorld. The pilot of XH9 stated that, while transients the Broadwater, they saw passengers being loaded into XKQ and the doors of XKQ closing. The pilot of XH9 recalled that their assessment at the time was that they would be clear of XKQ and that it would pass behind them. At 13:55 hours and 42 seconds, the pilot of XKQ commenced their scenic flight and was climbing over water in the direction of the sandbar near the helipad. The pilot of XH9 reported that they did not hear a taxi call over the radio from the pilot of XKQ. This does not necessarily mean that a taxi call was not made, and this topic will be subject to detailed analysis by the ATSB investigation. The pilot of XH9 also reported that they did not see XKQ depart from the park helipad. At about 13:55 hours and 47 seconds, the pilot of XH9 turned left onto a final approach path for Pad 3. The pilot of XH9 reported that at this time they were focused on the landing site, and on managing rotor downwash to avoid a pleasure craft crossing their approach path. Video footage taken by passengers in both helicopters on mobile phones contained images of the other helicopter. This does not mean that the helicopters were visible to either pilot from their positions in the helicopter, or even the passenger filming, and this aspect will be subject to detailed analysis by the ATSB investigation. At about 13:55 hours and 59 seconds, 2 passengers on board VH-XH9 cited XKQ. Understanding the helicopter would only get closer, at least one passenger attempted verbal guidance to the pilot. As the verbal guidance did not work, and anticipating a potential collision, one passenger physically alerted the pilot. The pilot of VH-XH9 later recalled being alerted to the other helicopter by a passenger, but the pilot did not see XKQ approaching prior to the collision. At 13:56 hours and 05 seconds, 23 seconds into XKQ's flight, at a height of about 130 feet, the helicopters collided. The main rotor blades of XKQ entered the forward cabin of VH-XH9. XKQ broke apart in mid-air and impacted shallow water next to the sandbar. The pilot and 3 passengers were fatally injured, and 3 passengers were seriously injured. The helicopter was destroyed. Helicopter VH-XH9 had significant damage to the forward cabin, instrument console, and main rotor blades. The impact turned VH-XH9 to the left, and the pilot continued with the momentum of that movement, completing a 270 degrees descending turn to land on the sandbar below them near to XKQ. The pilot and 2 passengers were seriously injured, and 3 other passengers had minor injuries. Context. Operator information. SeaWorld Helicopter's primary business was conducting scenic flights. These flights were generally on predetermined routes and of 5, 10, 15 or 20-minute durations. The operator's Air Operator Certificate, which enabled these flights, was reissued in July 2022 by the Civil Aviation Safety Authority for 5 years. The operator changed ownership in late 2018, with a new chief executive officer and chief pilot then appointed. It subsequently developed new heliport and park helipad facilities. The operator primarily utilized 2 Eurocopter AS350 helicopters for its flights, with occasional use of another EC130 until December 2022, when VH-XH9, XH9, and VH-XKQ, XKQ, were also introduced into service. It employed 3 full-time pilots and 2 part-time pilots. The operator was an independent entity to the SeaWorld theme park and held a concession for use of the land and brand. Pilot information. The pilots of both aircraft involved in the collision were experienced helicopter pilots with extended responsibilities within the operator. Both were qualified for the role and held valid Class 1 aviation medical certificates and valid flight reviews for the Eurocopter EC130. Additionally, both pilots were experienced flight instructors, meaning they were experienced in flying helicopters from both a left or right seat position. In most light helicopters, including the AS350, the pilot is seated in the front right seat. In the EC130, the pilot is seated in the front left seat. The pilot of VH-XKQ, XKQ, held an air transport pilot license, helicopter, and was a Grade 1 flight instructor. The pilot's logbook showed a total flight time of about 6,200 hours. This pilot was also the helicopter operator's chief pilot and head of airworthiness and maintenance control, and had managerial duties within the organization. The pilot of VH-XH9, XH9, held a commercial pilot license, helicopter, and was a Grade 2 flight instructor. The pilot's logbook showed a total flight time of about 3,150 hours. This pilot was also the helicopter operator's safety manager. Helicopter information. General information. The Eurocopter EC130 is a single-turbine engine helicopter, with a fenestron tail rotor and 2 rows of seats for a pilot, seated front left, and 6 passengers. The helicopter type had 2 main variants, the B4, available from 2001, and the T2, released in 2014. At the time of the accident there were 39 EC130s on the Australian Civil Aircraft Register, comprising 21 B4 and 18 T2 variants. VH-XKQ, XKQ, an EC130B4 serial number 4639, was manufactured in France in 2008 and had 2,267.5 hours total time in service. It was imported into Australia from Indonesia in September 2022, and first registered in Australia as VH-XKQ on 2 November 2022. It was issued a Certificate of Airworthiness on 9 December 2022 and entered service with SeaWorld Helicopters on 13 December 2022, commencing scenic flights on 26 December. It had flown about 9.2 hours since entering service with the operator. XKQ was equipped with pop-out emergency floats. Emergency floats were an operator-imposed requirement for operating from the park helipad. The maintenance release for XKQ and maintenance tracking system did not indicate that any outstanding maintenance was required. VH-XH9. VH-XH9, and EC130B4 serial number 3845, was manufactured in France in 2004 and had 6,785 hours total time in service. Most recently operating in New Zealand, it was first registered in Australia as VH-XH9 on 3 November 2022. Following inspection for issuance of an Australian Certificate of Airworthiness, it was released to service on 1 December 2022. XH9 entered service with SeaWorld Helicopters on 3 December 2022. It was used for scenic flights on 4 December before commencing regular scenic flights on 16 December. It had flown about 35.0 hours since entering service with the operator. Maintenance conducted in the helicopter following release to service included engine seal replacement, throttle switch replacement, transponder troubleshooting, wreckage and impact information. At the time of the accident, 13:56 hours and 05 seconds, the sandbar near SeaWorld was exposed. A high tide of 1.05 meters at 17:06 hours partially covered XKQ, and the next high tide was 1.49 meters at 06:05 hours the following day. The ATSB attended the accident site and recorded and recovered evidence on the sandbar in the time available. Queensland Police Service, on behalf of the coroner, recovered the helicopters and transported them to a secure facility. The ATSB made extensive examination of both helicopters at that facility. Damage to the nose of XH9 indicated that the main rotor blades of XKQ passed through the front of the cabin of XH9, severing several windshield and door frames. The windshield panels and several instruments in the pedestal were destroyed. The main rotor blades of XH9 showed damage and skin delamination, likely due to contact with debris passing through the main rotor system. A review of recorded video footage indicated that, following the mid-air collision, XKQ's rotor system, engine, and tail rotor system separated from the airframe as it fell and came to rest in a group, about 95 meters from the fuselage impact point. A review of video footage and the wreckage indicated that the helicopter impacted shallow water adjacent to the sandbar at a steep angle. The nose had rotated away from the direction of travel, and the helicopter had rolled approximately 70 degrees to the right at point of impact. Following the impact, the helicopter rolled to the left, coming to rest on its roof on the sandbar. Helipad and airspace information. The operator's helicopters were operating from two separate helipad facilities about 220 meters apart, with both managed by the operator. A separate operator also conducted frequent helicopter operations from another helipad, Marina Mirage, about 900 meters to the south. The airspace above the helipads is uncontrolled, Class G airspace, to a height of 1,500 feet. Communication between aircraft in the area takes place on a Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, CTAF. The same VHF frequency, 119.0, services Southport Aerodrome, about 9 km to the northwest, and Heck Field Aerodrome, about 27 km north-northwest. A CTAF has no defined boundary, however a pilot inbound for a CTAF must make an inbound call by about 10 nautical miles (18.5 km) from the landing site. A large volume of diverse aviation operations take place in the area of the CTAF, including tourist charter, private sightseeing, flight training, military operations, surf life-saving, police operations and parachuting. Although there can be a large volume of radio traffic on the local CTAF, the volume of traffic at the time of the accident was low. There were 2 helicopters operating from SeaWorld and 2 helicopters operating from Marina Mirage. Scenic flight procedures. The operator's pilots implemented common approach and departure paths to the helipads and used standard radio calls on the CTAF. Flight paths were chosen to maximize the availability of forced landing areas, and could be altered to the north or south depending on wind. The approach path of XH9 and the departure path of XKQ were both within the normal envelope of previous flight paths flown from those locations. Standard radio calls on the CTAF for the 5-minute flights were a taxi call just prior to lifting from the pad, an airborne call while departing over the SeaWorld grass to track north, an inbound call past Porpoise Point turning to track south. Pilots advised that they would broadcast additional calls on the CTAF for coordination of traffic if it was considered necessary to do so. Additional calls were also made on longer flights at turning points and as required. The longer flights all ended with the same flight path as a 5-minute flight, north to Porpoise Point and then a left turn and return to SeaWorld. The operator did not have, and was not required to have, a dedicated VHF frequency for additional communication between its pilots. Ground crew reported, in line with procedure, that they would communicate with pilots prior to a departure via hand signals and, where available, UHF radio. The operator's AS-350 aircraft had a UHF radio, which pilots used to communicate with ground crew. XHQ and XH9 were not configured for UHF communication at the time of the accident. These hand signals would indicate the type of scenic flight the pilot was to fly, and confirmation that a visual check of the aircraft and surrounds had taken place. The visual check included: doors are secured, nothing hanging outside the doors. The area is clear behind the helicopter and on any adjoining helipads. Ground crew stated that clearing the area behind the helicopter involved alerting a pilot to objects behind them, such as birds, tall masted vessels, and other aircraft. Review of recorded radio transmissions. Communications on the local CTAF were recorded at Southport Aerodrome. Due to the distance from this location, not all communications made on the frequency at or near SeaWorld or Marina Mirage were recorded, particularly those made close to the ground. A review of recordings and related information identified the following. No taxi calls from helicopters at SeaWorld or Marina Mirage were recorded, consistent with the helicopter's low height. The pilot of XKQ made an inbound call on their previous 10-minute flight at about 13:48 hours and 40 seconds, indicating they were on the correct frequency at that time. The pilot of XH9 made an airborne radio call at about 13:52 hours and 00 seconds, passing over the SeaWorld grass, and an inbound call at 13:53 hours and 40 seconds, just north of Porpoise Point, during which time XKQ was on the park helipad. One of the Marina Mirage helicopters departed the marina at about 13:54 hours and 00 seconds, heading southwest. The other Marina Mirage helicopter was at the coast near SeaWorld heading northbound over water, and the pilot made an inbound call at about 13:56 hours and 30 seconds. The pilot of one of the Marina Mirage helicopters recalled hearing the XH9 pilot's inbound call but did not recall hearing a taxi call from the pilot of XKQ, whereas the other Marina Mirage pilot could not recall hearing calls from either of those pilots in the period prior to the collision. No calls were recorded on the CTAF from about 13:54 hours and 00 seconds to 13:56 hours and 30 seconds. No other pilots were identified to be at a location that would hear a taxi call from a helicopter at SeaWorld and known to be listening on the frequency in the period prior to the accident. Based on recorded radio calls and known traffic in the area, no pilot was expected to be making a radio call on the CTAF in the period before XKQ became airborne, 13:55 hours and 42 seconds, indicating it is unlikely that any calls from VH-XKQ were over-transmitted at the time a taxi call would be expected to be made. Airborne collision avoidance systems. The operator was not required to equip its helicopters with an airborne collision avoidance system (ACAS). The operator's AS-350 aircraft were fitted with a traffic collision avoidance system (TCAS), a type of ACAS. Both XKQ and XH9 were also fitted with a TCAS. However, pilots reported that the systems had not been fully integrated in XH9 and XKQ, and both were only providing auditory alerts with no visual information. The operator's pilots reported that for the type of operations they conducted, the systems were useful while cruising straight and level, but of limited benefit maneuvering close to or on the helipads. The pilot of XH9 advised that they heard no auditory alert prior to the collision. Transponder systems. A review of radar and surveillance data of the accident flight and previous flights showed that the transponder on XKQ was correctly transmitting the aircraft's position and altitude, with the code 1200 selected. The pilot of XH9 reported that the transponder on XH9 had been selected on with the code 1200 selected. However, the transponder on XH9 was not transmitting secondary surveillance radar responses that were detected by radar surveillance equipment for the accident flight or previous flights. The operator was aware that there was a problem with the aircraft's transponder and that the aircraft was not able to be used in controlled airspace until it was rectified. Efforts to diagnose and address the transponder problem were ongoing. A review of all avionics and pilot assistance systems, and radar and surveillance information, is ongoing. Meteorological information. In the 3 hours leading up to, and at the time, of the incident, a ridge of high pressure extended up the southeast Queensland coast. Surface winds in the vicinity of the accident site were moderate southeasterly, about 15 knots, with gusts up to 20 to 25 knots possible. Near the accident site, there was scattered cloud with bases at about 3,500 feet above mean sea level, AMSL, and cloud tops at about 6,000 feet AMSL. No rainfall was recorded during this period, and radar imagery did not indicate any signs of showers in the vicinity. Safety action. The operator reported that it intended to address elements of aircraft visibility and aids to traffic detection. This included high visibility paint on rotor blades, additional strobe lighting on helicopters, introduction of helipad controllers who can provide traffic advice to pilots, use of live radar data displayed on an iPad in the cockpit. Further investigation. To date, the ATSB has conducted, and/or is conducting, the following activities. Interviews of the surviving pilot and adult passengers, eyewitnesses, and other pilots operating in the area at the time. Interviews with ground crew, other pilots, operators conducting similar operations, and maintenance personnel. Review of the operator's procedures and practices for operating scenic flights in the SeaWorld area, and those of similar operators. Examination of the wreckage of both helicopters. Examination of components of avionics systems of both aircraft, including radios and related equipment and transponders. Review of the maintenance and operational records of both helicopters and the process for implementing the helicopters into scenic flight operations. Review of the radio calls made on the Southport Common Traffic Advisory Frequency (CTAF) for these flights and previous flights. Review of radar and surveillance data for helicopter operations near SeaWorld for these flights and previous flights. Review of GPS data for these flights and previous flights. Review of CCTV and witness videos and images. Review of videos and images taken by the passengers on both helicopters. Reconstruction of the flight paths of each helicopter. A visibility study to determine the extent to which each helicopter was visible from the pilot's seat of the other helicopter. Review of the aircraft's traffic collision avoidance system (TCAS) functionality and similar technologies. Review of pilot training records, medical information, recent history and post-mortem reports. Review of passenger injuries and post-mortem reports. Analysis of survivability and forces through seat and restraint systems. A review of the regulatory surveillance of the operator and similar operators. Should a critical safety issue be identified during the investigation, the ATSB will immediately notify relevant parties so appropriate and timely safety action can be taken. A final report will be released at the conclusion of the investigation. Acknowledgements. The ATSB acknowledges the assistance of Maritime Safety Queensland, Queensland Police Service, and the Queensland Coroner in supporting the ATSB's on-site investigation team, and providing information and support through the evidence collection phase of the investigation. About the ATSB. The ATSB is an independent Commonwealth Government statutory agency. It is governed by a commission and is entirely separate from transport regulators, policy makers and service providers. The ATSB's purpose is to improve the safety of, and public confidence in, aviation, rail and marine transport through independent investigation of transport accidents and other safety occurrences, safety data recording, analysis and research, fostering safety awareness, knowledge and action. The ATSB is responsible for investigating accidents and other transport safety matters involving civil aviation, marine and rail operations in Australia, as well as participating in overseas investigations involving Australian registered aircraft and ships. It prioritizes investigations that have the potential to deliver the greatest public benefit through improvements to transport safety. The ATSB performs its functions in accordance with the provisions of the Transport Safety Investigation Act 2003 and regulations and, where applicable, international agreements. Purpose of safety investigations. The objective of a safety investigation is to enhance transport safety. This is done through identifying safety issues and facilitating safety action to address those issues. Providing information about occurrences and their associated safety factors to facilitate learning within the transport industry. It is not a function of the ATSB to apportion blame or provide a means for determining liability. At the same time, an investigation report must include factual material of sufficient weight to support the analysis and findings. At all times the ATSB endeavors to balance the use of material that could imply adverse comment with the need to properly explain what happened, and why, in a fair and unbiased manner. The ATSB does not investigate for the purpose of taking administrative, regulatory or criminal action. Terminology. An explanation of terminology used in ATSB investigation reports is available on the ATSB website. This includes terms such as occurrence, contributing factor, other factor that increased risk, and safety issue.
Well, that's the preliminary report. Now, I'll put a link to the actual report in the podcast details, as there are diagrams or figures that couldn't be shown, obviously auditable. So if you want to have a look at those figures, which is just showing the flight path and impact points and so forth, you can find those on the attached report. Well, that's it for this week. And as soon as the final report comes out, I'll put that out as well with the findings, and then we can have a bit of a discussion around what was found and the contributing factors. I dare say risk assessments are going to play a major part in this. Okay, until next week, thanks for listening and stay tuned. If you need help with any of these matters or would like to discuss further what my business can offer you, please go to www.southernstarsafety.com There you will find the services that I deliver and all my contact details. Stay safe and have a great week.
Important notice. The information contained in this podcast is general in nature and you should consider whether the information is appropriate to your specific needs. Legal and other matters referred to in this article are based on Southern Star Safety's interpretation of laws existing at the time and should not be relied on in place of professional advice. Southern Star Safety is not responsible for the content of any site owned by a third party that may be linked or advertised in this podcast. Southern Star Safety disclaims all liability, except for any liability which by law cannot be excluded, for any error, inaccuracy, or omission from the information contained in this podcast, any site linked to this podcast, and any loss or damage suffered by any person, business or company directly or indirectly through relying on this information.